applications are already impacted. So that's key for us to think about. We need to think about availability because uptime is very important for our customers and it's where value is found. ISO 20000 talks about identifying and managing risks to availability because in risk management, we actually ask the question, what can affect availability and how can we treat it, okay? And that's where now we have things like replication, we have things like failover, we have things like load balancing, we have things like disaster recovery. And so it's very important for us to do a risk assessment against availability and ask ourselves, what are the risks to availability of our infrastructure? And then also we need to define what are availability requirements, okay? You must remember in IT that not all IT infrastructure is equal, okay? So for some organizations, if you have end user IT services that are accessed by the general public, then you'll realize that the availability requirements for such a service are higher compared to a service that is used in the office on 8-to-5 basis. And so even as we plan for availability, we'll need to ask the question, what are our 24/7, 365 services? What are our 8-to-5 services? What are our services that are used from time to time, okay? And when we are planning for availability requirements, then we set targets, okay? And we measure ourselves against those targets, okay? And then if we have an incident that affects an availability, we treat it through incident management. The same thing applies to capacity. Capacity holds a very key dependency on performance, okay? If we don't get the right capacity, then most times the end user will feel the pinch, okay? So if memory or CPU is constrained, the end user will be hurt. If licenses are constrained, the end user will be hurt. It's very important for us to identify what are our capacity requirements. Do we know how many end users will use this service? Do we know at peak periods what's the amount of CPU, what's the amount of memory that is required? And then we define what are the service levels for capacity, okay? What is the response time for our application that is expected? Database query, what is the turnaround time? Those are capacity requirements. We need to define them upfront and then make sure we are monitoring them and then we are checking whether we are against our targets and implementing improvements. Security is key in infrastructure. I think a lot of the speakers before talked a lot around security, so I'll not belabor the point. As we implement infrastructure, we need to ask, do we have security in mind, okay? Usually best practice is security by design. That means by the time we are putting out an RFP for infrastructure, in the TOR, terms of reference or requirements, we have defined what is the baseline security requirements for this infrastructure. And then when we are deploying, we actually check, have we implemented the relevant security controls that are needed based on our requirements for our organization? And obviously, we monitor it. Continuity is key in infrastructure management because we need to ask the question about what is worst case scenario, okay? What is worst case scenario is flooding, cyber attacks, or fires to our data centers that can render our entire ICT infrastructure in the back end completely destroyed. So what is our plan B? It's very important for us to do a business impact analysis to determine which are the IT infrastructure that is most critical, and then come up with disaster recovery plans, implement them, and then conduct regular testing and training, okay? It's very important for you as ICT not just to say we have a DR site, but we have documented the steps clearly in our disaster recovery plan in terms of our playbook. How do we get the services that are in our DR site up and running? good organizations will make sure that throughout the year, we are running our services partially from DR, okay? So that we actually know, real world, that our infrastructure in DR is working and can support us, so that when the day of disruption comes, then we are certain about it. So a good way of testing is to make sure that in your plan, we made sure that we schedule that at certain points throughout the year, we will run our primary services from DR, because that's the number one check, okay? The other check, do not just think about infrastructure without thinking about the ecosystem of the infrastructure. And the ecosystem here is the people side of things. Are the members of our IT team, do they know where the disaster recovery plans are? Okay? And the disaster recovery plans should not be in your primary site. They should be in your secondary site. So do your team know where the secondary site is? Do they know where they will sit when they get to the disaster recovery site? Do we know from business impact analysis which systems and which services are we bringing up first, okay? So those are the kind of things that he needed. ISO 27031 will provide guidance on ICT readiness for business continuity, because it's the business itself that tells us what is the priority. And then we as IT create the plan to make sure we are ready. We need to make sure our people are ready, and that's where testing and training comes in. We need to make sure our suppliers are ready, so that our suppliers know what our disaster recovery plan is, they know where our site is, they know when we need them, we can get to them, okay? The other thing that comes to mind when you're thinking about your data center is about what is our readiness for at a data center scale. Because remember, our data center is also an infrastructure in itself. The Uptime Institute gives us tiers where you can actually measure yourself. Are you at tier 1, at tier 2, at tier 3, at tier 4? Of course, the higher the tier, the more the cost and the more the effort required for you to give the highest level of availability. Of course, we don't live in an environment where we have endless money. So we need to ask ourselves, with the current budget we have, what tier are we, and what sort of availability can we give our agency in case of a failover? Then we need to think about our change management practices, okay? We already know a famous proverb or saying in IT. Ukiguza hiyo tunalala hapo. That's a very important saying that we should we teach people who join our IT team during orientation. Ukiguza hii tunalala hapo. Ukiguza Friday tunalala weekend. So it's very important for you to define what is our change management practice, okay? One of the challenges we have in IT is that we want to fix things, or we want to test things and try things while systems are running, okay? So it's very important for us to have a formal change management framework, which means we register the change. That means we must have a system in which anybody who wants to make a change on our IT infrastructure, they'll register the change. When you register the change, you say, this is the change I want to do, these are the infrastructures I want to touch, and this is the day I want to make this change. And then the change is assessed. It's very important for you to put in place a role or a function that can assess the changes being registered. Reason is that sometimes the person who is registering the change might not understand the dependency. I might just be saying I want to work on a particular database or a particular server, but actually that server is carrying other systems, or that database is being used to process for another application. So it's very important that you have a framework for change assessment and then authorization, such that at any particular time, if we have a change, then it is clear that the people who own that asset and are responsible for it have assented to it, okay? And then once we get that authorization, we plan, we implement the change, And then it's very important for us to come back and do a change review. A change review simply confirms, was the rationale for the change achieved? And 2, did the change cause adverse effects which we were not expecting? So a good IT organization will always ask the question, are our changes providing value for us, both positive and negative? So it's very important that we do not just say, I upgraded the server, or I pushed this patch, or we've rolled out a new feature. But we always come back at the end of the change and do a post-review with key stakeholders, and then we update the change request. Good practice in change management is that whenever somebody is planning a change on a certain system, they come back and check the change records to actually see, what did the previous team do? How did they go about it? What were the lessons learned? And then use that feedback into planning the next change. Once